All right, so today we're going to be talking about the period between the French and Indian War and the outbreak of the American Revolution. So, roughly 1763 through 1775. As the smoke of the French and Indian War cleared in 1763, the British stood triumphant. Yet few could have predicted that a rebellion would arise among the victors. Still, within only 12 years, the colonists that had fought shoulder to shoulder with the Union Jack would raise muskets against it. This is the story now of how allies quickly became adversaries, and how, honestly, a series of small sparks ignited a revolution. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the Seven Years' War, had redrawn the map of North America. France was now effectively kicked out of Canada, Spain took Louisiana, and Britain emerged with an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Unfortunately, this victory had cost Great Britain a lot. The victory had brought with it a staggering debt. The war had cost Great Britain over £130 million, a sum that Parliament now wanted to recover. To London, it seemed reasonable that the American colonies, who had benefited most from the war, should share in its costs. To the colonists, however, this was the beginning of a betrayal. Matters actually began first not with expenses and taxes, but with the Proclamation Line of 1763. This line, which was running roughly up the seam of the Appalachian Mountains, and you can see it there on the map, forbade settlement west of the mountain range. The idea was that this would prevent conflict with Native American tribes that lived in that region. Having fought the French, the last thing that the British wanted to do was now have to turn around and use their armed forces to protect the colonists as they encroached upon Native American lands. But the American colonists despised this action. America was a land hungry nation, its settlers eager for fresh farmland to the west, and they had no intention of following along with this proclamation line. So all it did was make situations worse on both sides. But the real trouble began with taxes. In 1764, Parliament, and I mean the British Parliament, passed the Sugar Act, cutting the duty on foreign molasses in half, however, but increasing the enforcement and expanding taxation on other goods like coffee and wine. Though it affected relatively few American colonists directly, it established a dangerous precedent: taxation not for trade regulation, but for revenue. The big problem with the Sugar Act wasn't so much the sugar, but it was the free molasses that colonists had been importing from places like Jamaica and Cuba and turning into cheap rum. Now that that was going to be taxed, suddenly this gravy train was going to dry up, infuriating colonists, particularly in the mercantile oriented region of New England. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, 1 year later, which required printed materials from newspapers to playing cards to bear a government issued stamp. This time, the outcry was immediate and widespread because the British weren't even taxing anything that they were producing. They were just requiring an arbitrary tax on paper goods that the colonists themselves were creating. No taxation without representation quickly became the rallying cry. Colonists insisted they could be taxed by a body, Parliament, but only if they had a voice in that Parliament. At present, of course, there were no American colonists who had seats in the House of Lords or in the House of Commons. Now, to the British, that made no sense at all. This complaint made no sense. They believed in a concept called virtual representation. In the idea of virtual representation, all British subjects were represented by members of parliament. It had nothing to do with geography. It was the sheer representation that mattered, not where the representation came from. So every member of the House of Commons, from the British perspective, spoke for every member of the British Empire, whether or not they were elected. To the Americans, this was nonsense. Protests erupted, merchants boycotted British goods. In Boston, they burnt and hanged large effigies of tax collectors. A group calling itself the Sons of Liberty emerged, first in Boston, led by Samuel Adams and others, and then similar groups cropped up throughout the colonies. These weren't idle protesters. These men threatened, tarred and feathered, and intimidated stamp distributors into resigning. By the time the law was set to go into effect, there was no one left to enforce it. And so it was that in 1776, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but it passed what was called the Declaratory Act the same day, insisting that Britain had the right to legislate for the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever, end quote. While the storm had subsided, it had not passed. In 1765, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, introduced new duties on glass, paper, and tea, which were set to go into effect in 1767. These duties, taxes, were named after him. And so the Townshend Acts, like the Stamp Act, aimed to raise revenue. But this time, it did so indirectly through import duties rather than internal taxes. To the colonists, this is the same exact offense and made no difference whether it was a tax or a duty. They knew that they were paying more. And the response was once again resistance. Non importation agreements soon spread from port to port throughout the colonies. British custom officials faced boycotts and violence. In 1768, British troops had to be sent to occupy Boston, an armed reminder of imperial authority. That occupation reached a boiling point on March the 7th, 1770. There, a confrontation between soldiers and townspeople escalated into violence. British troops fired into the crowd, killing 5. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, later remembered as the first martyr of the American Revolution. Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, which you can see there, is not accurate, but it was devastating propaganda. Soldiers firing in cold blood on unarmed colonists. The image raced across the colonies like a spark across tinder. Parliament backed down, repealing the Townshend duties except for a tax on tea. And that remained, unfortunately, a stubborn symbol of Parliament's authority. And so then things came to a head in another turning point. By 1773, tensions had cooled, but a new crisis loomed. The Tea Act of 1773 did not raise a tax. In fact, it actually lowered the price of British tea. But it granted the struggling British East India Company a monopoly. Now, people in Boston and throughout the colonies could not import their tea from whoever they wanted. They had to buy it from one company, the British East India Company. The colonial radicals, the issue here was principle, not price. Accepting the tea would be accepting Parliament's right to tax. And so, as ships bearing the British East India Company tea approached colonial ports, protesters sprang into action. In Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the ships to leave without unloading. And so, on the night of December the 16th, 1773, men disguised as Mohawk Indians, I'm assuming not disguised very well, boarded 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, and dumped 342 chests of tea, about 92,000 pounds, into Boston Harbor. This was a loss that it's difficult to quantify. In today's money, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars of lost revenue for the British East India Company. The Boston Tea Party shocked Britain. It was destruction of property on a massive scale, and immediately the British decided it couldn't go unpunished. In 1774, Parliament struck back with the Intolerable Acts. These were actually known in Britain as the Coercive Acts, but America called them the Intolerable Acts. There were five components to them. Number one was the Boston Port Act. It closed the harbor down completely until the tea was paid for. Number two, the Massachusetts Government Act eliminated any efforts at self rule by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Administrative Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crime to be tried not in the colonies, but back in England. Fourth, the Quartering Act forced colonists to house British troops. And lastly, the Quebec Act, passed simultaneously, though completely unrelated to the Tea Party, extended religious freedoms to Catholics in Canada and expanded its boundaries. This angered Americans who were by and large Protestants and who wanted to speculate on land along the St. Lawrence River, which is the border between the United States and Canada today. The message that the British were trying to send was clear. Resistance would be met only with repression. But instead of cracking the colonists apart, all these acts did was produce more unity. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. For the first time, men from Georgia to New Hampshire sat in the same table, not this time as British subjects, but in their mind, as Americans. They issued what was called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They condemned the intolerable acts and called for a renewed boycott, but the colonies also prepared for war. At this time, the future President of the United States, John Adams, wrote, quote, "We are in the very midst of a revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable in any history of nations." Then things finally broke. By early 1775, General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, had orders to suppress the rebellion. And so, on the night of April 18th, 1775, he dispatched troops to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize a stockpile of local arms. But the countryside was awake and knew they were coming. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out to warn the militias. At Lexington Green, the Redcoats, British soldiers, met a small band of militia. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired it. But it began the war. 8 colonists were killed. The British pressed on to Concord, where they were met with fierce resistance. On their retreat, they were fired upon all the way back to Boston, behind trees and stone walls. And by day's end, nearly 300 British soldiers were dead or wounded. The American Revolution had begun, not with a declaration, but with smoke and gunpowder.